The grand ballroom shimmered under the soft golden lights, the hum of conversation blending with the distant melody of a live jazz band. Emma adjusted the strap of her dress, feeling slightly out of place in the sea of executives and polished socialites. She had accompanied her husband to these events before, but tonight felt different. There was an energy in the air, an anticipation she couldn't quite place. Her husband, Mark, had been talking about Daniel Foster for years, the man who built his empire from the ground up, the kind of boss who demanded excellence and gave nothing less in return. Emma had expected someone intimidating, distant. Yet when she turned and met his gaze for the first time, she felt something entirely different. Daniel was standing across the room, effortlessly commanding attention in his tailored suit, his presence magnetic. His dark eyes lingered on her for just a moment too long, his lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. Emma felt her pulse quicken, caught in his gaze before Mark's voice pulled her back to reality. "Emma, this is Daniel Foster," Mark introduced, the admiration in his voice undeniable. Daniel extended a hand, his grip firm yet warm. "It's a pleasure," he said smoothly, his voice low, his eyes never leaving hers. Emma nodded, her voice steady despite the sudden heat rising to her cheeks. "Likewise, I've heard a lot about you." "All good things, I hope," Daniel replied, amusement flickering in his expression. Her husband chuckled, oblivious to the current passing between them. "Of course. I tell Emma all the time there's no one sharper in the business." Daniel tilted his head slightly, considering her with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. "I think your husband gives me too much credit," he said, though there was no modesty in his tone. The conversation flowed seamlessly. Mark engaged in an eager discussion about the latest market trends, while Daniel remained effortlessly composed. But Emma could feel it. Every glance, every shift in his posture. His attention was on her. A waiter passed by, and Emma reached for a glass of champagne at the same moment Daniel did. Their fingers brushed, a fleeting touch that sent an unexpected jolt up her arm. She withdrew quickly, but not before noticing the small, knowing smirk that played on his lips. Mark excused himself to greet another colleague, leaving Emma and Daniel alone. "I take it these events aren't really your scene?" Daniel asked, his voice softer now. Emma exhaled a quiet laugh, relaxing slightly. "Was it that obvious?" "A little," he admitted, his gaze lingering. "But that's not necessarily a bad thing." Emma knew she should look away, steer the conversation to something safer. But instead, she met his gaze head-on. "And what about you? Do you enjoy them?" Daniel's lips curved slightly, as if she had asked something far more interesting. "Let's just say, I enjoy certain aspects." The air between them shifted. The polite professionalism thinned, replaced by something else, something unspoken but unmistakable. A game had begun, and Emma wasn't sure she knew the rules. The late afternoon sun poured through the towering glass windows of Daniel Foster's office, casting long golden streaks across the sleek modern space. Emma smoothed her dress as she stepped inside, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She had agreed to help organize the upcoming charity gala, a favor for her husband, but the moment she received the message from Daniel's assistant, she knew this was more than just business. Daniel stood by the window, his silhouette outlined against the city skyline. When he turned, his sharp gaze landed on her, a slow smile forming as he strode forward. "Emma, I'm glad you could make it," he said, his voice as smooth as the whiskey that sat untouched on his desk. She returned his smile, keeping her composure. "Of course. Mark mentioned you needed help finalizing the details for the gala." "I do," Daniel replied, gesturing for her to sit. "But more than that, I prefer working with people who understand the importance of elegance. Your husband tells me you have excellent taste." Emma felt a flicker of something dangerous under his words, but she ignored it. "I like to think so," she answered lightly, opening the folder she had brought with her. "Shall we get started?" They went over guest lists, venue arrangements, and sponsorship details. Yet, every time Emma looked up, She found Daniel watching her, his attention unwavering. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his desk, his voice dipping into something more personal. "I have to admit, I was pleasantly surprised when Mark suggested you help. I didn't expect someone so intriguing to be involved." Emma tensed slightly, though she kept her expression neutral. "I'm sure you work with plenty of interesting people, Mr. Foster." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Call me Daniel. And yes, but rarely someone who holds my attention as much as you do." Emma inhaled sharply, her heart stuttering at his boldness. The room suddenly felt smaller, the space between them charged with something unspoken. She should shut it down, steer the conversation back to business, but instead she found herself drawn in by his confidence, the way he spoke with quiet authority. She tilted her head slightly, playing along. "That sounds like a dangerous thing to admit." "Only if it leads somewhere it shouldn't," he murmured, his gaze locked onto hers. A silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of choice. Emma's pulse thrummed in her ears, a warning she chose to ignore. When she finally stood to leave, Daniel walked her to the door, his presence close behind her. As she reached for the handle, his hand brushed against hers, the slightest touch, but enough to send a shiver up her spine. She turned, finding him too close, his expression unreadable. For a second, neither of them moved. Then, with a controlled smile, he stepped back, his voice low. "I'll see you at the gala." Emma nodded, her throat dry before slipping out of the office. The cool air of the hallway did nothing to calm the heat that had ignited inside her. This was dangerous, and she knew it. Yet, as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The night of the gala arrived, and Emma stepped into the grand ballroom, her breath catching as the glittering chandeliers cast golden light across the elegantly dressed guests. The air buzzed with conversation and the soft melody of a string quartet, but her focus was elsewhere. She felt his presence before she even saw him. Daniel stood near the bar, exuding effortless confidence, his black tuxedo crisp and perfectly tailored. When their eyes met, the flicker of recognition between them sent a shiver down her spine. He didn't look away. Neither did she. Mark, oblivious to the silent exchange, rested his hand on the small of Emma's back. "This turned out even better than I expected," he mused. "Daniel's really outdone himself." Emma forced a smile, nodding. "Yes, it's beautiful." Her voice sounded distant, even to her own ears. Minutes passed, and Daniel made his way through the crowd with a glass of whiskey in hand, stopping to greet guests with the kind of charm that made him impossible to ignore. Eventually, he reached them. "Mark," Daniel greeted smoothly, shaking his hand before turning his attention to Emma. His gaze lingered, a private conversation passing between them in mere seconds. "Emma, stunning as always." She swallowed, her lips parting slightly before she composed herself. "Daniel, thank you for inviting us." "My pleasure," he replied, his voice low, intimate. "I see you've been keeping everything in perfect order." Mark chuckled, oblivious. "She's been incredible. I told you she had an eye for these things." Daniel's smirk was subtle, yet knowing. "Yes, you did." His eyes flickered over her dress, the deep emerald satin hugging her figure. "And you were right." A waiter passed by, and Daniel gestured toward the terrace. "Mark, I need to discuss something about the expansion project. Why don't we step outside for a moment?" Mark nodded eagerly. "Of course." Emma knew it wasn't a coincidence when Daniel's hand barely grazed hers as they moved past one another. She exhaled, steadying herself. She had spent days convincing herself that what happened in his office was just a fleeting moment, a game she had no intention of playing. But now, standing in the same space as him again, she wasn't so sure. As the night continued, Emma found herself drawn to the terrace for air. The cool breeze was a welcome contrast to the warmth of the ballroom. The sound of the city hummed in the distance. Then a presence behind her. "You shouldn't be out here alone." Daniel murmured. She turned, her pulse quickening. I just needed a moment. His gaze was steady, piercing through her resolve. And yet, here we are. The weight of his words settled between them, thick with implication. The sounds of the party faded, leaving only the space between them. Dangerous, intoxicating. Emma knew she should leave, but she didn't move. Neither did he. The weeks following the gala blurred into a dangerous rhythm. What began as fleeting glances and stolen moments had transformed into something undeniable. Emma found herself finding excuses, reasons to be near him, reasons to stay just a little longer in his presence. A last-minute meeting, a quick follow-up discussion, a charity event that somehow required her input. Every encounter pushed the boundaries further, every conversation laced with an unspoken understanding that they were teetering on the edge of something irreversible. Lies became second nature. At first, they were small, telling Mark she was staying late at a planning session, claiming exhaustion when she pulled away from his touch at night. But soon, they grew more elaborate, intricately woven to create a version of her life that kept suspicions at bay. When Daniel called, she answered. When he asked her to meet him, she went. The thrill of secrecy, the rush of feeling desired, kept pulling her back in, even as the weight of deception pressed against her conscience. One evening, after yet another late charity meeting, Emma arrived at Daniel's office, her heart hammering in her chest. The office was dimly lit, the glow from the city skyline casting soft shadows across the room. He was waiting for her, leaning against his desk, watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice. He pushed off the desk, closing the space between them in slow, deliberate steps. "Then why are you?" His voice was low, rough, filled with something dark and unrelenting. Emma didn't have an answer. Or maybe she did, but admitting it would make this real in a way she wasn't ready to face. When Daniel reached out, his fingers tracing the bare skin of her arm, the hesitation melted away. The first kiss was gentle, almost testing, but the restraint didn't last. The weeks of tension, of restraint, snapped like a tightened cord finally giving way. His hands found her waist, pulling her flush against him, his lips moving against hers with a hunger that mirrored her own. The weight of logic, of morality, dissolved in the heat of his touch. Clothes became an afterthought, discarded in the quiet urgency of the moment. His hands explored her skin with practiced precision, his mouth trailing against her neck, her collarbone, igniting sensations that had long since faded in the routine of marriage. It was reckless. It was wrong. But it was intoxicating in a way she had never felt before. Afterward, as she lay against him, the realization of what she had done settled in her bones like ice. The guilt came crashing down, wrapping around her throat, making it hard to breathe. She told herself this was the last time, that it couldn't happen again. But when Daniel traced circles against her bare back and whispered, "I don't think I can stop," she knew she wouldn't either. Emma moved through her days in a haze, her mind constantly torn between the exhilaration of Daniel's touch and the weight of her growing guilt. At home, Mark's presence felt like a reminder of everything she was betraying. She noticed the way he looked at her, curious at first, then concerned. He had started to pick up on the small changes. "You've been distracted lately?" Mark said one evening as they sat at the dinner table. His voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it. Emma forced a smile, pushing the food around her plate. "Work has been hectic with the charity event. You know how it is." Mark studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Yeah, I do." But his gaze lingered, as if searching for something he couldn't quite place. She had become more careful, making sure to delete every message from Daniel, keeping her phone face down, stepping away when she answered his calls. But the paranoia had started to creep in, a constant presence in the back of her mind. The thrill that once came with secrecy now felt like walking a tightrope with no safety net. One afternoon, she was in Daniel's office, his hands gripping her waist as he pulled her onto his desk, lips feverish against her skin. The world outside ceased to exist when they were together, a dangerous bubble where nothing mattered except the way he made her feel. But the knock on the door sent a jolt of fear through her. "Mr. Foster, your wife is on the phone," Daniel's assistant called from the other side. Emma's body went rigid, her breath caught in her throat. Daniel sighed, pressing a kiss to her neck before reluctantly stepping away. "I'll handle it," he murmured, adjusting his shirt. Emma scrambled to fix herself, heart hammering as she smoothed her dress. As Daniel picked up the phone, his voice effortlessly composed, she slipped out of the office, her pulse still racing. The fear was exhilarating, intoxicating even. But it was also a reminder, this affair wasn't just thrilling, it was dangerous. And yet she didn't stop. Each stolen moment with Daniel pulled her deeper. She told herself she was in control, that she could walk away whenever she wanted. But the more she gave him, the more he demanded. "I want to see you tonight," he texted late one evening. Emma hesitated. She had already made too many excuses, dodged too many questions from Mark. But she also knew the truth. She would go. She always did. Daniel knew it too. He had stopped waiting for her permission, stopped asking if she was sure. He knew exactly how to push her, how to make her want him, how to make her forget everything else. And that was the most terrifying part of all. She had thought she held the power in this affair. Now she wasn't so sure. The moment Emma walked through the front door, she knew something was wrong. The usual sounds of the television humming, in the background or the clatter of Mark working in the kitchen were absent. Instead, silence wrapped around the house like a heavy fog, thick with unspoken words. Mark sat at the dining table, his fingers clasped together, his gaze unreadable. Her heart pounded in her chest, an instinctive warning. She tried to keep her expression neutral, to act as if nothing had changed, but the weight in the air told her there was no escaping whatever was about to unfold. "You're late," Mark finally said, his voice eerily calm. Emma swallowed, setting her purse down carefully. "The event planning ran over," she lied smoothly. "You know how these things are." Mark nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "Yeah, I do." He exhaled, rubbing his temple before looking at her, his gaze sharper now. "Emma, is there something you want to tell me?" Her breath caught. Her mind scrambled for an answer that would make this moment pass, that would allow her to walk away unscathed. "What do you mean?" she asked, forcing a small laugh, but it sounded hollow even to her own ears. Mark's hand slid across the table, revealing her phone. Her stomach lurched. She had been so careful, deleting messages, turning off notifications. But somehow he had found something. "Daniel Foster." Mark said the name like it burned his tongue. "How long, Emma?" Panic surged through her. She shook her head, stepping forward, trying to reach for the phone. "Mark, it's not what you think." His eyes flashed with something dark, hurt, anger, betrayal. "Then tell me what it is," he challenged. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Because what could she say? That it started as nothing? That she never meant for it to go this far? That she had convinced herself she was in control, only to realize she had lost control long ago? The silence between them stretched unbearably. Mark finally pushed back his chair, standing. "I deserve the truth." Emma's hands trembled. She wanted to deny it, to salvage what was left. But the truth clung to the air between them, suffocating. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered, voice barely audible. Mark flinched like she had struck him. He took a step back, running a hand over his face. "I can't believe this," he muttered. His voice broke on the last word, and the sound shattered something inside her. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed. Daniel. Mark's gaze flickered to the screen, and his jaw clenched. "Of course," he muttered bitterly before grabbing his keys. "I need to get out of here." The door slammed behind him. Emma stood frozen, staring at the phone. Another message appeared. "We need to talk." Now Daniel wasn't going to let her walk away so easily. Emma sat in the dimly lit kitchen, staring blankly at the untouched cup of coffee in front of her. The silence in the house was suffocating. Mark hadn't returned. Hours had passed since he walked out, and she wasn't sure if he would come back at all. Her phone lay on the table beside her, the screen still glowing with Daniel's message. "We need to talk." Now she should ignore it. She should delete his number and erase every trace of him from her life. But even now, her fingers itched to respond. The thrill, the secrecy, the way Daniel made her feel, like she was alive, wanted, had pulled her so deep that the idea of stopping felt impossible. But reality had caught up. Her marriage was unraveling, and she could no longer pretend that she was in control. Another buzz. "I'm waiting." Emma exhaled sharply, pressing her hands against her temples. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had convinced herself that she could juggle both worlds, that what she had with Daniel was separate from her real life. But it wasn't. It had bled into everything, poisoning her home, her relationship, and now, her future. She hesitated, then picked up the phone, typing a response. "Not now." Seconds later, his reply came. "Either you come to me or I come to you." Her stomach twisted. He wouldn't, would he? Daniel wasn't a man used to hearing no. He had always gotten what he wanted, and she had been so willing, so eager to give in. But now that she was trying to pull away, he wasn't letting go so easily. She grabbed her keys and left the house before she could overthink it. Daniel leaned against the bar in his penthouse suite, watching Emma as she stepped inside. Her posture was stiff, guarded, so different from the way she had once melted into his touch. "You're late," he said smoothly, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Emma crossed her arms. This was a mistake. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Which part? The first time you kissed me? The nights in my office? Or the part where you enjoyed every second of it?" Her breath hitched, anger flickering in her chest. "My husband knows." He didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow sip of his drink before setting it down. "And?" Emma blinked. "And? That's all you have to say?" Daniel exhaled, walking toward her, his movements deliberate. "What did you expect? Emma? That this wouldn't catch up to you?" He tilted his head, eyes sharp. "Or are you here because you're afraid of losing him?" Emma clenched her fists. "I need to fix my marriage." Daniel smirked, stepping closer. "Then why are you here?" She hated that she didn't have an answer. She hated that even now part of her still wanted him, and she hated that he knew it too.